Hello and a very warm welcome to our event on the question of whether climate change can be tackled without ditching economic growth. My name is Guntram Wolff and I'm the director of Bruegel, and I'm very pleased to host today this event at Bruegel. And we have two excellent speakers. Francesco Starace is the Chief Executive Officer and General Manager of Enel. And he is also in various important boards and advisory boards. Let me just mention one, which is the Sustainable Energy for All, which is a major initiative to ensure sustainable energy also for the poor people. And with me is also Simone Tagliapietra, who is a senior fellow at Bruegel and with whom I've actually written a paper. So we have written a joint paper on exactly, together with our colleague Klaas Lennertz, on exactly the question on of whether growth, economic growth, and addressing climate change are compatible, or whether in fact one needs to grow less in order to achieve the Paris climate goals, or even more ambitious climate goals. I will let Simone talk for a few minutes about this paper, really, and then we want to engage in the conversation with Mr. Starace. Thank you both for being here, and apologies to our audience for the delay. Simone, please.
Thank you, Guntram, and thank you, Mr. Starace, for joining us today. The economic profession is very divided on whether economic growth can be decoupled from greenhouse gas emissions. There are different schools of thought. On the one hand, we have the green growers claiming that it is possible to maintain economic growth while decreasing emissions. And if you think, for example, at the European Green Deal, there are institutional policy frameworks that are clearly inspired by green growth sort of thinking. On the other hand, we have the degrowers who think that ditching economic growth is the only possible way to respect our environmental boundaries. So Guntram and Klaas and myself try to really reflect on this body of scientific literature and understand what can be a possible way forward. And the conclusion we reach is that degrowth is not a realistic option. It's not a realistic option simply because either poor and rich countries would like to grow in order to ensure the wellness of their people. So the real question here at stake is how can we decouple global emissions from economic growth? And this is, of course, difficult because if we look at the current projections of global population and GDP per capita, these imply that to achieve net zero by 2050, the world must reduce the rate of CO2 emissions per unit of real GDP by 9% per year, which is basically 6 times a faster decoupling of what we have seen over the last 20 years. So the question is, how can we accelerate this decoupling of emissions and economic growth? In our view, there are basically 4 ways to do that. The first is to scale up green investments. Different organizations, from the International Energy Agency to the International Renewable Energy Agency, estimate the current level of energy investments globally at 2.5% of GDP. In order to meet our net zero targets, we will have to increase these energy investments to around 4.5% of global GDP. And importantly, most of these investments will have to be green. So here there is a very important role, of course, to be played by governments, because governments will have to, of course, foot part of this bill, notably in certain part of the energy infrastructure investment requirements. But it is particularly the case for the private sector here to cover most of the investment needs. And here, in our view, it is particularly important for governments to create the incentives for the private sector to move. Therefore, here we think that carbon pricing together with environmental regulations, is really the key lever governments have at their disposals to make sure that we get to these green investment flows that is needed to get to net zero. The second element relates to innovation. In order to decouple emissions from economic growth, we need the technologies available. We do have a success story, which is the one of renewable energy sources that now needs to be replicated in other technologies, such as batteries, for example, such as green hydrogen. And this is very important because in order to get to the deep emissions reduction required to get to net zero, we will need these technologies, namely after 2030. The third element here is behavioral change. It's important to have people on board and to facilitate the transition by limiting our demand also for energy, notably in the difficult sectors to decarbonize. Finally, climate adaptation. We need to live with the fact that the climate is already changing, and we need therefore to scale up adaptation investments at the same time we do mitigation investments. So in our view, these are the four pillars to green growth, which is an imperative, as we said at the beginning. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Simone, for this very short and succinct summary of our paper. And let me immediately turn to Francesco Starace for his first reactions and, of course, for a sectoral view, I guess, a view from a major player in that space that is investing in that space, is investing in the technologies, but also in the infrastructure. And, you know, that is one of those companies that will be absolutely crucial in this transition towards a net zero economy. So where do you see, where do you stand on this? I mean, what's your first reactions on the paper, but also can you give us a sense where Enel and the company stands and what are the key issues that you are facing?
Thank you, Guntram and Simone. And again, apologies for the delay, which, by the way, I should say to everyone, it's my fault. It just was impossible for me to be there in time. But this is the last days before the G20. It's a very tough moment. But apart from this, I think the study is super interesting. And let's reflect on the fact that there would have been no study at all only 10 years ago. I mean, 10 years ago, this would be not a point of discussion. Growth and carbon intensity were supposed to go hand in hand. And let's say decarbonizing was considered to be a cost and let's say a leverage of inefficiency in a system rather than anything else. But what Simone just indicated, technology has done something in these last 10 years. I would say that if you take the last decade, so 2010 to 2020, you can call this the decade of renewables, during which the world has understood that the renewables are not a niche, nice, small game, but it's today the cornerstone, the backbone, if you want, of power generation in general going forward. So they have become so competitive and so pervasive and so quick in their growth that you can see things that were unthinkable 10 years ago. IEA saying renewables are the way to go, which was kind of impossible 10 years ago. So this decade has proven that there is no more a trade-off between growth and decarbonization, but the two things can go hand in hand, most of the times, if not always. Now, what this decoupling word that we also heard from Simone means, you might recall, those that have a little bit of an age like me, that it was a very simple exercise to predict the GDP of a country, to look at the electricity demand growth of the country itself. There were algorithms and correlations that were pretty precise, predicting the GDP of a country, looking just at the electricity demand growth. And then during the past decade, what happened is that this link that was so straightforward between electricity demand and economic GDP growth broke. There was a decoupling. And this decoupling happened mostly in OECD countries first. There was an observation that, as the GDP per capita reaches the $10,000 threshold, you have a breakup of this link. Below, you still have this link. Above that, there is a breakup. What is that? It's the fact that the economy becomes less intensive in the use of energy, more efficient, if you want, in converting energy into GDP, and also that the industry itself becomes more efficient because of technology playing into the industry itself. We're not aware of it, but this is happening all the time. It's something that we have unconsciously in our systems building up all the time. So again, technology helps in making best use of energy and not increasing brutally the use of energy in itself. So I would say the view we have in this is that there is no more a match to be made or to be win or lost by one of the two parties, but there is a self-reinforcing mechanism, and that the economies that decarbonize and become circular faster are those economies that tend to be growing better and in a less risky manner in the next future. Then one can say, what happens this decade from this point of view? Because renewables are not anymore anything new. They will continue their path of increasingly penetrating the energy systems of the world. But what next? And we see that the next decade, there will be a discovery of another big trend that is already underway. It will just become, say, more visible and more clear to the observers, and that is the electrification of energy demand of the world. So the penetration of electricity in domains of the economic activity of the world that have not seen it before. So this trip that electricity is going to make, for example, in the transportation sector through the evolution of mobility, the trip that the electricity will make in the heating sector by driving out fossil fuels of the heating of our buildings, the trip that electricity is making in several industrial sectors. This will subvert, again, the equilibrium between the ideas of growth and the intensity of carbon linked to that growth. So we believe that progressively we will see additional decoupling of growth, no more from electricity, but from other energy sources. The question is, will it happen fast enough? Will it happen in the right direction fast enough? The direction is that one, okay? The question is whether there will be time to go through this before the damage becomes too big. And here I think the answer is not only to the market forces or to the individual companies, but also to governments and regulators and policymakers, because they can influence the direction of this evolution if they put in place policies and regulation frameworks that help this transition, that make it happen in an orderly fashion rather a turbulent one, and that for once in the history of mankind, make sure that this transition is not a generator of inequalities, but happens in a more uniform fashion. Because let's not forget, most technological transition of the past have ended up generating progress, but inequalities, because they were not managed in a conscious manner. This is unfortunately true for most of the past. So we now have a chance to do this in a more organized manner, because I think there is a global problem. This is the only new thing about this transition. It captures a problem that affects everyone. You know, climate is totally democratic from this standpoint. So this is a new leverage that we have in order to drive and try to drive this transition, which again, I stress, it's inevitable. It will happen. It's just a question whether it will happen slowly and turbulent manner or fast and orderly manner. We can drive these two things.
Thank you so much for this clear response. And I would like us to talk a little bit more about the decoupling issue more specifically before we then also hear perhaps a more sectoral perspective from you and your company. But on the issue itself, and we are getting actually lots of questions already. There's several questions really relating to the challenge and wondering whether decoupling is actually feasible at a sufficient speed. For example, one of the persons here talks about Greta Thunberg, who was mentioning eternal economic growth as a fairy tale, and arguing that we need to really change the model. And even Minister Cingolani, whom we hosted this morning, Italian Minister for the Environment, Cingolani, he said this morning also that there is a need to rethink the growth model. And I would love to hear, of course, both of you on that, but also give my own perspective. And when I can say on this issue, when we looked at the numbers, I think we really need to say the challenge is absolutely enormous. As Simone pointed out, the decoupling has to accelerate by a factor of 6. Now, when you look at the numbers in some more detail, what you see is that so far, most of the decoupling that we see is that we use slightly less energy per unit of GDP. So that's what we see currently. So that's what we saw in the last 2 decades. But the opportunity now is about reducing the emissions that we need for energy production. And that's where the new technologies come in. And I think we have certainly technologies available to, as you said, Francesco Starace, to decarbonize electricity production. Those technologies have now become price competitive, actually. But there are significant sectors in the economy where those technologies are actually still quite expensive, and we don't have those technologies at the moment. Now, then you can have a philosophical debate whether it's realistic or not to say we continue growing. My personal view on this is that we can't tell. Let's say a poor Chinese household that he shouldn't become a middle class household. So you can't. I mean, you can tell them, but this logic of sacrifice, I don't think people will listen to this sufficiently at the global scale. So I think in the end it's more philosophical. In the end, I think we have to do the necessary things and invest to get the technologies. Otherwise we will fail, and so that's my view on this. But of course, I would love to hear from both of you. Actually, I mean, as Simone, I summarized our paper a bit. So if you want to add one point that I forgot, or Francesco, Simone, perhaps one.
Well, if I may just recall one word that was said before by Mrs. Starace about inequality. Here we have a huge issue with energy access in different countries in the developing world. We have people without access to electricity, without access to clean cooking facilities. Here, the trick is that probably this technology that we are getting available in Europe and elsewhere is now an opportunity for these countries to meet their own energy demand in a sustainable manner. So I think matching this technological availability with the necessity of providing energy to all, I think it's another way to foster this transition in a way that is really also socially coherent globally.
Guntram, I think that there is no doubt that mankind wants to continue to grow. And this is it's embedded in our chromosomes. I think it would be futile to try and change this and say, you have to admit that your children will have less and less and less. This is impossible. And I think it's, by the way, a proposition that will only remain with a few strange people. I don't understand this logic at all. And I agree with you. You can tell someone in Africa or in China or whatever that, look, sorry you were born in the wrong part of the world. It's not your fault, but you cannot grow more than that because the world has enough carbon and you cannot afford to put more. I mean, this is impossible. It's just ridiculous, actually. I think that, if you look at numbers and what today we can do about them, it's amazing the potential that we have in front of us. And, because you mentioned our minister, I can tell you the Italian energy consumption figures for 2019, and we're talking about a country that has 1,300 terawatt hours of overall final energy consumption in the country itself, okay? Out of which 417 are transportation, 362 are residential, which means basically eating and cooking, and lighting, illumination. 212 are services. Just 290 are industrial processes. So you're looking at the fact that if you put electricity into the transport business, into the transport sector, you are not going to zero, but you slash the energy demand probably by half, just for the efficiency standpoint, because electric motors are 3 times more efficient than internal combustion engines. If you put the same on residential with heat pumps, you have more or less the same impact. So same for services. So apart from the decarbonization potential, if you keep decarbonizing electricity, you just cut consumption. You just have the same performance with less energy input because technology today enables this. This was not there 10 years ago. So, and that's only Italy. Germany has basically doubled the Italian consumption, but it's roughly the same figures. You're talking about 2,300 terawatt hours in Germany with the more or less proportions that are quite similar. So at the end of the day, the thing is, it's so deep in our society, it's so stratified by decades of certain technologies being used that we fail to understand the potential that we have. That's Europe, okay? And now, if you take, in Italy, it's a very efficient energy system. If you want, it's one of the countries that has the lower energy GDP ratio. But if you take the US, the potential is even larger than that. I mean, the waste there is unbelievable. If you take Russia, it's incredibly more. So the world is wasting a lot of energy using technologies that are obsolete. So it is possible to sustain growth and use less energy. The answer is absolutely yes. It takes a lot of change and it needs the governments to be driving this. So governments means not just one minister here, one minister there, but the whole. So the work is monumental because you have to change the mind of thousands and thousands of bureaucrats that manage this kind of things, which is not their fault. They were educated with that world. And now that is the requirement. That's why I think initiatives like this one is important because they spread competence and they spread know-how about and knowledge about this simple fact that today technology allows a better, much better, not just better, much better use of energy without sacrificing growth.
So we are getting interesting questions. So one question, and I want to throw both questions at both of you. 2 questions. So one question is on it's on the distribution of the energy use because of course at the moment it's the affluent, the rich that consume much more energy than the poor. So is there some logic, or can we think of something where the poor, the rich in particular, shoulder the responsibility and reduce their energy consumption? So that's one. And the other one is much more policy driven because you also mentioned the the role of government. And so a person here is asking, well, what should EU member states and EU institutions do in order to for the decoupling to happen fast enough so that we reach the 1.5 degree Celsius goal? So really, what are the government actions needed? I would say, if I can, I mean, it's not just the EU question, it's a global question. The EU currently emits 9% of global emissions. And of course, we need to get the other 91% of emissions down as quickly as we want to do it in the EU, if we ever want to have a chance of the 1.5 degrees Celsius, which I have to say looks increasingly difficult and unlikely that it will be achieved. I mean, given the pledges of major emitters such as China. China is the biggest emitter. China wants to continue increasing its emissions until 2030. And so it looks very difficult to actually achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius. But still, I mean, what can governments do? I mean, what are the key policy levers that you think need to be triggered? And also this inequality question, inequality of consumption of energy, I think is a very interesting and important question. And perhaps this time we start with Francesco and then we get Simone.
Look, I think that maybe I will answer the government's first question and then the other one, rich versus poor. I mean, if you look at, I don't like this story that Europe only emits 9% and so we should stop China. I mean, the question is that the CO2 works as a stock. It's not what you emit today that matters. It's what you started emitting the first time you started burning something fossil, which is basically 1750, but two centuries ago. So if you look at that from that standpoint, by 2030, China will match what Europe has already emitted.
Yes.
Because Europe started first. And I would tell you that for a century, the only emitting part of Europe was the UK until basically end of 1850. So
I mean, I appreciate that, but can I challenge you on? I mean, I know that this fact is, you're absolutely correct with this fact, but what does it mean in terms of? I mean, if we have an exhaustible budget now, right? So we need to bring down everywhere the emissions, including in China.
The reason why I'm making this, because sometimes people are saying, even if we stop emitting, there will be the planet will sink anyway, so we should just keep emitting anyway, because that's it. So I think this is not the right story. I think Europe has, if you want, and the US, which today is the historical larger emitter with 27% of the overall CO2 that is in the atmosphere today. The US is number one, Europe number two. I mean, I think we have, if you want, an additional responsibility, that is show the others what can be done to avoid this, but do it to ourselves. And so prove that it works. Prove that you can decarbonize the economy without killing growth on our own social system, and then prove that this can be done without exacerbating or augmenting inequalities, but actually reducing them. If Europe proves that, then I think the rest of the world, they're not stupid. They will say, okay, why should we just don't do it? I mean, it's best for everybody. So I think we should look at it this way. Europe has a responsibility and an opportunity. The responsibility comes from the past, the opportunity is from the future. The opportunity is to use the technologies that we have, not those that we dream we will have in 2090, the fusion and other stuff, that we have today, change our business systems using technology, prove that this is growing, this is a growth opportunity, and in the meantime, show that inequalities, so separation between rich and poor, are not increased, but are rather decreased. So your second question about rich and poor, I think it's not a question of rich people, poor people, but rich states, poor states, because, you know, domestic consumption is just a tiny part of this story. Okay, the problem is the economies that are efficient, the economies that are inefficient, the economies that are wasteful, the economies that are intelligent in using the energy. Again, here, it's not necessarily true that a rich economy is also wasteful. this is again proving to be a mistake in the logical sequence. If you take Russia is an economy that has a GDP slightly above Spain, but the amount of energy it's using by unit of a GDP is almost 4 times. So it's an incredible testimony of how you can change things. And it's not a rich state. It's a developed world, but you cannot say that it's a super rich part of the world. But it's using a lot of energy anyway. So it's not necessarily the two things go hand in hand. The US is just an extreme out of the world part that, you know, everything should be abundant, including food in the restaurants. But that's part of the mentality that needs to be fixed. But it's not because you're rich that you need to be wasteful. So I think the question is between those that understand the transition and those that do not understand. That's where the difficulty will be. Those that will resist it and be part of it only because they are caught by it, and those that will drive it. That's a distinction that we're talking about. And I think here, Europe has a chance to use the powers and the intelligence and say, this transition is good for everybody, and we want everybody to be part of it, not just this guy that understands it and the other guy that doesn't get it lose. No, everybody should get into that. I think here lies the uniqueness of Europe. That's really the essence of Europe is in this particular sense. If we can get that responsibility and use it properly for everybody else to use.
So our time is already coming to the end, but I do want to get Simone to react perhaps to some of what we've heard and perhaps address one question in particular, which is about when we talk about the EU response, but perhaps more specifically the behavioral changes that we also talk about in our paper. That is also a question in the audience. I mean, can you say just 1 or 2 words on EU response and the behavioral change necessity to achieve the net zero, please?
Yeah, I very much agree with Mr. Starace on the fact that Europe is a laboratory of global decarbonization. We are certainly the front runners in this process, and we need to demonstrate the viability of getting to net zero in an economically and socially viable manner. Concretely, I think there is one thing that Europe can do to not only to accelerate the decoupling, but also to let's say, foster this laboratory, which is a prompt implementation of the Fit for 55 package, because we do have a pathway to get to a certain level of ambitious emissions reduction by 2030. We need to now adopt it, and that's, as we know, is a responsibility now of the members of the European Parliament as much as national countries to really foster this policy framework ahead. On the issue of the behavioral change, I think there are very interesting numbers that have been done by the European Commission on how much it will cost to get to our new 2030 climate target. And if you look at the 2 different scenarios that were created, one only relying on technological developments and another one relying both on technology and behavioral change, it becomes clear that the behavioral change has an opportunity to cut the investment requirements for the transition by almost a third. So if we manage to consume less energy and to therefore have these through energy efficiency on the one hand, but also behavioral change on the other through energy conservation, model shifts in transport, etc., that will make the transition less expensive and therefore more viable sooner in time. So I think the behavioral change is important as an enabling factor for the transition, notably for the next 10 to 20 years. One very last point on the international dimension. I think given the fact that we need also to reflect on emissions from a stock basis, no? So we need to inevitably take into consideration the historical responsibility, and that's indeed the cornerstone, no, of the Paris Agreement, the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. I think it's now high time for developed countries to offer developing countries the alternatives to grow in a sustainable manner. And that's exactly what the climate finance discussion that we will see at COP26 will be all about. That is, I think, the most important single element that we will be discussing at COP, because it really provides substance to the key principle of the Paris Agreement of common but differentiated responsibility. So if we are not able to match this gap that we currently have, and apparently we will still have until 2023, how can we expect developing countries to move? We need to support them.
All right, I'm afraid our time is up. I don't know if Mr. Starace, you want to add anything at the end. Otherwise,
no, I really thank you for this opportunity, because I think the moment is super important, and the behavioral changes that Simone was mentioning before show how important, again, policies are. I mean, behaviors changes can happen one by one. It takes ages, or it can happen quicker if policies are designed in the proper manner. And for example, the reason why Italy has a fantastic circular economy is not because Italians are circularly minded, but because for some reasons, the Italian government in the years has established effective circular-driven policies that finally drove this system into a virtuous manner. So I think policies and regulators are a key player to change this in a proper way. And that's why I think, you know, G20, COP26, everything that goes to our governments is important to help them understand how their role is at this stage. It's really crucial.
wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Starace, for thank you, Simone, for the stimulating discussion. And thank you to our audience that was so active and so interested in this issue, really. And it shows, I think there's really a lot to discuss still. And rest assured, we will have more events on this and related topics. So please join us again on our website. And thank you, Mr. Starace, again. It was wonderful to discuss with you. Until next time, bye-bye.
Thank you. And again, apologies for the delay.
No problem. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining.